I'm very pleased and very honored to introduce Stamatia Portanova. Stamatia Portanova is a thinker and she's a scholar, but she's also a research fellow at the Department of Human and Social Sciences at the Università degli Studi di Napoli Orientale in Naples. That's where we met her. We had the pleasure to meet her a couple of months ago. She's also a member of the Technoculture Research Unit, a very interesting unit that is looking at digital technologies, different processes of communication and culture. So also very recommendable. It's a wormhole for those of you who look into the Technoculture Research Unit. Her research focuses on technology, obviously, philosophy, digital culture, and many other topics. She's the author of several co-authored books, but especially a monograph with a very intriguing title, Moving Without a Body, Digital Philosophy and Choreographic Thoughts, published by MIT Press recently. And she has published countless articles in many influential journals and venues, such as Artificial Intelligence and Society, Body and Society, Computational Culture, Space and Culture, Fiber Culture Journal, and nothing less than Angelaki. Today, I'm going to go a little bit into what Stamatia is going to talk about. She's going to develop further an idea that she kind of gave us a little nugget to the lecture that we had in Naples with our students on the digital chrono-epistemology, or a temporal framework, if I understand this correctly, temporal framework of AI, forms of AI as an organizing tool turned into an autonomous instituting entity whose operational velocity is increasingly, invariably intervening on human organizations, introducing, as we said, this concept that Stamatia is developing of digital chrono-epistemology. She's going to do this through a framework from architecture of artificial intelligence from instrument to institution. And that way, please help me to give a warm welcome to our first guest and keynote of the day.
Okay, thank you. So you can hear me well, can't you? Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Thank you to the organizers. I feel very honored to be here. And I would like to thank all the people who participated in the organization of this fantastic event. I don't know all the names. I can just mention Stavros and Andrei. So unfortunately, there will be a lot of people whose names I can't, but I'm really thanking everyone at this point. I also would like to ask the audience to pardon me because I'm still struggling with the McDonald's hamburger that I had yesterday evening, and so this actually prevented me from, establishing the kind of focus that I would have liked to have. But I'll do my best to say something reasonable. I would like to start my presentation today by mentioning the word, like the keyword that I was actually given by the organizers when they assigned me the task to think about institutions and to reflect on this thing, which is an institution. And so obviously I said, okay, so I'm going to go to a Deleuze event full of Deleuzean people. So I'm going to read again Deleuze's work on instincts and institutions, which was one of his earliest works, where he collected basically a series of mentions, of citations, of quotes about instincts and institutions, adding a kind of introduction. So in this little book, then Deleuze defines institutions and what they are. For Deleuze, then institutions are procedures of satisfaction. That's the main thing that he tells us in this brief introduction. So an institution is a procedure of satisfaction. It's basically the development, the human development, and this is important. We start with the human development of artificial means to achieve a satisfaction. The satisfaction of a need. So importantly, it's important to underline this human nature, and the reason for this specifically human prerogative over the satisfying procedure, over the instituting procedure. So there is a reason why these institutions basically are typically a characteristic of the human, and this prerogative lies in the possibility of indecision. So for Deleuze, institutions are are specifically human exactly because of the characteristic of indecision, which characterizes human cognition. The human is undecided, basically. So indecision is like, in the way in which Deleuze describes it and the way in which I read it, this indecision characterizing the human is a possibility which leaves space and which leaves time for intelligence to appear. So it is from this time of the indecision that intelligence appears, and therefore it can start to preempt, to prevent, to plan the satisfaction of a need. So, in other words, for institutions to be instituted. So the main concept and the main key point I would like to start with then today is this link existing first and foremost between institutions and time. So institutions are first and foremost dependent on time, I think. The emerging of this interval of time, of the time of indecision in human cognition, time to think. So the conceptualization of indecision as a sort of physiological property of the human mind, exactly because of the way in which the exact conformation of the human brain and nervous system can actually be found, and Deleuze found it in all his later works, in the Bergsonian conception of phenomenology. So the way in which Bergson theorizes the body's sensory-motor causality. So basically the fact of enfolding perceptions from the outside, enfolding past perceptions, affections, sensations, and then these affections and perceptions, after being enfolded, while being enfolded, are transformed into an invitation to act consequently. So this is much simplified, the kind of sensory-motor circuit that Bergson offers to Deleuze's reflections. So there is a kind of space-time in this enfolding invitation activity of the human and of human cognition, that it is in this unfolding or enfolding invitation that actually a multiplicity of potentials appear. So a multiplicity of diverging and converging potentials. Brian Massumi would define this as intensity. It is in this space-time of indecision and of intensity that potentials appear. And this kind of emerging of potentials is non-consciously felt. So it's felt non-consciously as a moving in between, a sort of infinitesimal gap that opens. Gap is not maybe the best word to be used here, but still, maybe if we add the word infinitesimal, it can give it a little bit of more precision. So this kind of sort of infinitesimal gap appearing, continuously preceding, continuously following the actual perceptions and actions of the human body. Like a sort of punctuation, of continuous punctuation of life and of its linear flow-like proceeding. This is what I call the non-temporal time of indecision. Then to retrospectively perceive something, to retrospectively perceive an object, means to subtract an actual form from this relational field of potential, while to prospectively act by anticipation means to construct an object. But what remains important in all this conceptualization is, as I said before, what I defined before as the gap, the interval, the edge, the moment of indecision and indetermination, time to think, time to institute. At this point now, from what I've been saying so far, it would seem that institutions could be understood from a kind of phenomenological approach, almost in phenomenological terms, a la Bergson. And it would seem that this kind of phenomenological approach would be sufficient to understand Deleuze's concept of institutions, or where they come from in the human, intending the institution, as we said before, as the actualization of the anticipative nature of human intelligence. intelligence. It's a kind of phenomenological interpretation of institutions that seems to be supported by Deleuze's own introduction to the little book that we are seeing on the screen, where he basically starts with a differentiation between human and animal exactly on this basis, on the fact that the difference between humans and animals is represented by the emerging of this sort of hiatus, of gap, and then the consequential possibility, basically, of knowing time. It's exactly because time is punctuated and the gap opens itself that time then can appear to human consciousness. So in the temporal opening is contained time, basically, conscious time, or the consciousness of time. This temporal opening appears as the basis of the animal instincts, human institutions dualism. But in fact, what makes the phenomenological approach, the Bergsonian phenomenological approach to institutions, in fact, not enough, not sufficient to understand Deleuze's discussion of institutions as modalities of satisfaction, is the fact that they are intrinsically social. So this is another character that Deleuze adds to his description and theorization of institutions. Institutions are human, and institutions are social. They are not of an individual nature, but they are of a social nature. While the needs, the desires, the tendencies to be satisfied are of the individual, the possibility of their satisfaction is actually given by sociality itself, or what Deleuze himself defines the collective nature of intelligence. So, opposite to the tyranny of the law, actually the democratic character of the institution, in fact, does not consist in limiting the individual, but in actually facilitating the satisfaction of the individual. Only at a secondary level, institutions of a more social nature, like born to satisfy social needs, derive. But the first and fundamental relation is that between individual tendencies and social intelligence. So at this point, it's very interesting. Deleuze asks a sociological question. He says, therefore, for sociology, the most interesting and important question to be asked would be, in what way do these social forms of satisfaction, institutions, come to form themselves? And here we go back again to the idea of time. So the idea, just to conclude this first part, that I think emerges very interestingly from Deleuze's introduction and from his thoughts on institutions, is the relation between the collective character of intelligence and time. Because Deleuze says what explains the social nature of the institutions is the fact that a solution to be found, a synthesis, he calls it a synthesis to be found, a solution to satisfy individual needs, maybe would require a duration, a time span that the individual would not be able to survive. So it's not necessarily the case all the time that solutions or syntheses can be found in an immediate way, like in the relation, he says, between body and water. There is a relation which is direct and immediate between a part of which the body is composed, which is hydrates, and the composition of water. And so this is a kind of direct, immediate relation. But it's not always the case. That's not always the case, says Deleuze. So sometimes the solutions are so perfectible, not perfect, but perfectible, not immediate, but requiring reflection. And so this is actually what determines the fact that the individual, that their solution would require a time and a duration that the individual cannot live and does not live. And so this is where the idea of a collective intelligence in Deleuze's work appears. The last step on this theorization of institutions that the philosopher makes, that Gilles Deleuze makes, is asking how then these social institutions act in relation to individual tendencies. And the answer given by Deleuze is the sense of the social intervention is to integrate circumstances, so integrate circumstances in a system of anticipation and putting facts in order, ordering facts in a system which regulates their appearance. So in other words, the institution is the composition of a systematic structure. a systematic structure of facts and circumstances which replaces the instinct or the animality of the human species. In a controversial affirmation, and here I would like to quote Deleuze himself, Deleuze proclaims that man does not have any instinct, but only realizes institutions. He is an animal that is undressing itself of the species. So social intelligence is what remains after this undressing of the human, and a mode of knowing and acting by preemption, prevision, planning. And importantly, it is also in this undressing of the human by of its species belonging, of its animality, that, as I said before, the emerging of time consciousness appears. But there is also another possibility that emerges. Together with the useful actions and techniques characterizing the institutions to satisfy needs, something else, which we will find later, something else so interestingly emerges in this gap of indecision, in this human gap, and it's the uselessness of the expressive gesture, the uselessness of art. So what appears in the hiatus is basically the difference and the separation between the interest of scientific activity and of the instituting activity on one hand, and the disinterestedness of art, tools and rights. So, institutions, what's the sense, basically, of this whole introduction, of this long introduction that I just made, is basically, it was meant to basically tell something, also, you know, maybe I could have told it in less words, but it's basically the fact that institutions do not simply appear in time, but they appear together with time. So institutions appear in the opening of this gap of temporal consciousness, and they appear simultaneously to time, to the human. So I would like to investigate this relation, again, between institutions and time more in depth. What you can see in one of the two images is the Royal Greenwich Observatory. The Royal Greenwich Observatory was, as everyone can easily find and read online on our nice and useful Wikipedia, is that this observatory was, until its closure, which happened in the late 90s of the past century, it was the oldest scientific institution in Britain, in Great Britain. And it was founded for navigational purposes in the 17th century, in 1675, by King Charles II. In Greenwich. And its primary contributions were for navigation, astronomy, the determination of it was an observatory, so determining the position of the stars, publishing an almanac. So the observatory began publishing his nautical almanac in 1766, and it was that year and that occasion of publication of the almanac which institutionalized the Greenwich longitude, the longitude of Greenwich as the universal baseline, the universal location to actually start to calculate time. So, which practically means that the main function of this kind of institution was basically global timekeeping. Now, we have spoken so far about institutions as the satisfaction of needs, of human needs and solutions to problems. So this particular institution, which is the Greenwich Observatory, referred to a particular and very old problem, which is measuring time, how to measure time, measuring time with precision. Before the 18th century, before the foundation of the observatory, Europe, so this is the cultural location, the cultural frame we are speaking about specifically. So Europe was subject to solar time. So basically time was measured by sundials. Maybe some of us know, or maybe not, that the movement of the Earth around the Sun is not a perfect sphere. It's not circular, but it's an elliptic elliptic movement, and the Earth is a little bit tilted. So basically all this, what does it tell us? It tells us that when you measure time in solar terms, according to the movement, to the rotation of the Earth around the Sun, then the length of seasons and of hours, sorry, not of seasons, but of hours varies according to the season. So basically the length of the hour is not the same according if you are in the summer, in winter, etc. Hours are not always the same. When mechanical clocks were introduced, then there was the appearance of mean time. Mean time is, contrary to solar time, the appearance of a kind of average time, time which is always the same, hours always having the same duration. So solar time started to be replaced by mean time, but there was still a little bit of a battle between cities in Europe where mean time started to be adopted more quickly and easily, and local small villages or towns where the meridian, so the way of reading time through according to the movement of the sun, which is the movement of the Earth, basically. So there was this kind of differentiation. What is important to understand is that time, until that time, was a very local thing. So it depended. So in cities, you could find mean time. In small villages, you could find another way of measuring time. So there was a very local conception of time. And so the establishment of these local standards made possible the fact that localities could actually synchronize themselves, but there was not universal synchronization in terms of time. A sociologist whose name is Aviatar Zerubbabel, in fact, talks about the very interesting story of the social process of establishing a unique standard time reckoning framework. This kind of standard time appeared together with the invention of the clocks, of the timekeeping mechanisms based on hours, minutes, seconds, etc., as artificial inventions. But it was also the idea of global standard time that was one of the fundamental inventions of that collective intelligence we have talked about before, apparently collective. Since the 1840s, in fact, there was the appearance of media and communication, communication systems like the telegraph, for example, but also railway, transportation systems that started to become more and more complex. So in the end, it became very difficult to sustain a kind of global economy, because that's also the main key word to understand all this process, to support a global economy due to all these differences in time. So basically the railway system, the telegraphy, capitalism, maybe you could say, needed global synchronization. It was not sustainable anymore. Time became a matter of money, related to the matter of money in a globalizing economy where the flow of capital was dependent on the precise, measurable flow and movement of goods, information, and people. And so in order to facilitate all this flow, what was needed was a standard time system. This standard time system accompanied the cultural, philosophical process of rationalism, or emergence in Europe of the philosophical currents of rationalism, a rational way, basically, of knowing reality that characterized the modern era, and that took the specific form of disassociating time from nature, and so from natural time, and transforming it into a kind of discontinuous, abstract, artificial time. So in a nutshell, all this was the background that led to a conference in 1884, the Prime Meridian Conference, which decided that the Greenwich Observatory would be the prime meridian from where all longitudes had to be started to be counted. And it was set like the beginning of the universal day. The day in universal terms was established that should start at midnight of Greenwich Mean Time. And there was also the decision that the hours should be counted from 0 to 24. So all these natural acquisitions and this institutionalized way of knowing time that we have been using so far is actually the result of an institution that was very much the result of activities and reflections in a very localized space and time. Even the watches, all the clocks and the watches that we wear, that we see everywhere, I like to think of them like little portable extensions of that gigantic institution that is the institutionalization of the temporal standard, and that was embodied by the Greenwich Observatory. So this time we are speaking about, which is the 19th century, is the classical golden age where then all institutions were born and developed. Most of the modern institutions as we know them today were born in that time. And they were all regulated by the fundamental institution of standardized time. So it's like the institution par excellence. There was, and now I'm doing a little bit of a kind of a sort of chronological little story. With time, there was an exponential growth in information available, basically. We know that modernity was characterized also for the increase in the available information, an information explosion in the quantity of information that was available to social intelligence. And so there were a myriad other systems of classification, standardization that started to develop from that era onwards. Foucault, for example, Michel Foucault is a great master when we want to do a sort of genealogical history of all these systems of classification. And these systems started to appear in all industrial, public, scientific institutions of the West. For example, the introduction of Taylorist and Fordist management systems, but overall, there was a kind of engulfment. All this led also to a kind of a sort of bureaucratic or informational engulfment in these institutions. And doing a jump forward in time, all this increasing complexity and availability of information for the Western institutions led to something that we found 1 century later, and we are now at the end of the 20th century. All this led to the emerging of the so-called Californian ideology. Why I'm mentioning this so all of a sudden? The Californian ideology, the utopian vision in which communication technologies would actually be able to solve all problems, to find all solutions, to solve all problems of organization by diminishing the significance of institutions and by facilitating direct interaction. In 1968, I'm just mentioning one of the famous technology thinkers, engineers, scientists of the time, Douglas Engelbart, for example, understood that the two main factors of velocity and complexity would be the measure for all human organization, velocity and complexity of information. So having reached the level where human beings were not able to cope anymore with all this quantity and complexity of information, so all this led to the progressive development of the Californian utopia, starting to conceive of technology as the lever for a new model of society, more simplified with respect to the old ancient European cultural model and cultural elaboration of state and public institutions. Communication now reduces the function and the utility of institutions in that it is based on a direct relation between subjects. We don't need the intermediation of institutions anymore. And this famously is also the basis of Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web. Anti-institutional rhetoric. This anti-institutional rhetoric could be applied again to the question of time. There is one example that I mentioned and worked on in my previous work in relation to this kind of to technology and its relation to time, and it's the blockchain technology. I don't know how familiar is the audience with this kind of technology, but just to give a definition of the blockchain technology, the blockchain technology can be defined as a sort of automated representation of time. It's an automatization of time, the automated representation of time as a linear arrow or a measurable flow. So basically, thanks to this kind of magic technology, we are now able to solve the old problem of Einsteinian relativity and the fact that every locality has their own time, even maybe every individual, each one of us has its own time, their own time, or maybe each part of our body has its own time. So it's a kind of Einsteinian nightmare, basically, where relativity seems to dominate. But thanks to this incredible technology, which is blockchain, maybe we have solved the problem. So we can inaugurate a new day of measurable simultaneity in the end, in which the building, so basically this is how, in a very simplified way, the blockchain works. It works by building a series of blocks. No? So there are a series of blocks of transactions so that all the connected computers, all the computers that are connected to intelligence, basically that are connected to the system, basically what happens is that they can finally all agree on the real exact order in which the transactions, a series of transactions took place. Famously, the blockchain is the technological system that is at the basis of the Bitcoin and then of all the other cryptocurrencies that developed after that. So basically, it's a way to find a technically codified convention of time, synchronicity allowed by the decentralizing function of the blockchain. No need for institutions anymore. The blockchain is the technology that basically tells us in what we have to believe, what is the real time in which things happened. All participants can finally agree and distinguish which one was the first transaction, which one was the second, which one was the third, and so on. And so this finally manages to solve problems like the priority of the transactions and the global coordination of all the nodes. Nick Land, a controversial theorist, very criticized, very appreciated, has worked specifically on this technology of the blockchain from a very philosophical point of view, saying that it's a metaphysical object. It's basically artificial time. Blockchain is artificial time. And so it's like the final stage of all that process of temporal standardization we started talking about. The machine has finally succeeded where the clock, the Royal Observatory, and all those old things had failed. The old problem of measuring time and find a synchronization. I like to think of this blockchain, of this series of blocks of transactions, in terms of what Deleuze and Guattari define as a milieu. So I've heard a few presentations this morning, and it seems like the word milieu still remains as one of the favorite in the Deleuzian in the studies of this philosopher. And actually, I also think that it's very important for me, at least when thinking about time, it's very important. So the blockchain, to me, it reminds me. Totally reminds me, like in a sort of perfect way, of Deleuze and Guattari and the way in which they talk of a milieu. A series of coded blocks of space-time, a linear arrow, which is not reversible, and it's also made of a set of periodic repetitions of one same component. In the blockchain, that would be the component of the transaction, one transaction after the other. So time becomes linear again, and it's cut into segments. Now, while being linked to a kind of socio-economical model, the monetary transaction. The monetary transaction is like the blockchain. Now, let's not forget, this is not a detail, it's very important. At the basis of this new kind, the new way of temporal standardization, there is a socio-economic need appearing together with it in a direct way, even more direct than the navigational needs in the 19th century. And in fact, we know, as we said before, that the blockchain is at the basis of the Bitcoin exchange and of the crypto values. But when we think about the milieu, Deleuze and Guattari remind us that the challenging and interesting side of milieus is not just that of being milieus in themselves. Yes, it's a very interesting concept, but what makes them very interesting is the fact that they exist in order to intersect with each other. Every milieu does not exist on its own, but milieus, the characteristic of this concept in Deleuze's philosophy is the fact of intersecting each other, of transcoding themselves one into the other, or producing basically a rhythm. So my question to the blockchain was, is it able to produce a rhythm? Does it have a rhythmic sensitivity, this kind of temporal measure automation system? Or in more technical terms for a programmer, having a rhythm by a technology like the blockchain would mean, is it also able to distinguish events from states? Yes, the blockchain is able to count, to measure the series of events and the order in which they happen, but can it distinguish an event from a state? Why am I mentioning this word? Because recognizing states is a characteristic of another kind of technology, which is artificial intelligence. So differently from the blockchain, which in a kind of dumb way can just measure time according to this sequence of blocks, artificial intelligence seems to be obviously a bit more intelligent. So what it actually does is to transform every problem into a graph, no? A set of states. No? It's not so linear. No? It transforms problems into graphs of states, into sets of states. So basically, I'm not going too much into technical details, also because I'm not really the expert at this point, you know. But, you know, I tried to read from my kind of theoretical and humanistic point of view as much as I can in terms of understanding how these technologies work. But the point of my presentation is not to explaining how the technologies work because I know it exactly, and so I find a parallel in conceptualization, but because I find it interesting to see the way in which the technologies are described and in the way in which they work is described. So what we are being told, well, also when reading scientific papers and things like that, is basically, it makes us understand like these two technologies, blockchain and artificial intelligence, being very interestingly related. Blockchain is very good at keeping time. It's got a good memory. It's got a memory of what happened in the past thanks to its blocks, etc. But it's not very intelligent. It doesn't really understand time. It just measures it. Artificial intelligence is the opposite. Artificial intelligence doesn't really have a sense of time. It forgets immediately. Like when it finds a solution, everything that it did before, it immediately forgets. It doesn't have a memory. It's just very intelligent. And it's very good at anticipating the next move. So this gave me the impression that the two technologies were actually combined in their lacks and in their strengths. So they seemed to be lacking, but also having something that when put together in combination, it provided a sort of total perfect cognition of time, the memory of the blockchain and the future anticipatory intelligence of artificial intelligence. But it was not just my idea, in fact, because then when looking a little bit on the internet, but also when looking at the way in which these technologies actually work together, what I found out is that actually they work together. Very often they are starting to be put together. So blockchain is combined to artificial intelligence. In a previous work of mine, I defined the two conditions of these two technologies as chronopathic conditions. Taken on their own, these two technologies seem to have strong chronopathic conditions. It's not anticipative, like the blockchain is not anticipative. It doesn't have a vision of the future. Artificial intelligence doesn't have a memory. They're not very good with time. But once they are combined together, they start to form like the perfect cognition of time, or maybe the perfect cognition of time in the human way in which we are actually used to know it, like this flow going from the past of memory towards the future. So inference and memory, intelligence and synchronization are the two characteristics that the perfect means of temporal measurement and temporal cognition should have, also in technological terms. And in fact, I found it. The famous robot Sophia. Sophia is one of the most known mediatic representations of where artificial intelligence combined to robotics can actually go. And Sophia is, this robot is a product of a collaboration between a blockchain company based here in the Netherlands, which is called the Singularity.net, blockchain and artificial intelligence company, and a Hong Kong-based company, robotics company. So the two companies brought this singular entity, product, intelligence, which is Sophia, and making her work thanks to this combination of blockchain and artificial intelligence, so that she is mostly defined as almost human, a pseudo-human or an almost normal humanoid. So why Sophia? Because, as I said before, Sophia technically works as a series of different artificial intelligences. She's got an artificial intelligence to see, one to respond to speech, to language, one to do several artificial intelligences made to do different things. speech recognition, visual recognition, all sorts of things. But they are separated, these artificial intelligences. They cannot dialogue with each other, but thanks to the blockchain in some way, also I'm not going in much technical detail now, thanks to this blockchain, the artificial intelligences of Sophia can dialogue together, can be combined. So she becomes a perfect humanoid. So she is able to mimic that kind of circuit we had started this discussion from, receiving from the past and anticipating in a future action. She's almost a perfect human, apart from one fact, apart from lacking that moment of indetermination, that kind of indecision gap we had started our discussion from. She is the anti-institutional hero par excellence, obviously, so with Sophia we would really have no need of institutions anymore, but this is also what makes her, I think, particularly scary. So how much time do I have? 10 minutes. Phew. Time is not, I'm not very good with time. So as the no, it's true. So yeah, I'll try to do, yeah. So anti-institutional Sophia, but also apparently hyperhuman. Anti-institutions, but very human. Very human because, as I said, her combination of blockchain and artificial intelligence makes of her the perfect representation of the human cognition of time. She's reliable, like all artificial intelligences using the blockchain are reliable, because being reliable, what does it mean? It means to have a kind of, you know, a trustable notion of the past, a good memory of what happened, like an objective memory. So she's reliable, but she's also very intelligent because she knows how to anticipate, how to calculate, how to predict, etc., etc. So she's, you know, imitating, apparently reproducing human cognition and the human cognition of time at the service of the human, but doing without institutions. Apparently, this is all that there is to be said about technologies and time then. So all the way, or about the way in which algorithms work in relation to time, not at all. There is something more to be added, and I took the idea from what you see. Obviously, you won't, on the left, you won't really understand, also because maybe, the writing is in a good size, but it's in Italian. So this is an Italian comic strip. So unless you read Italian, but I will explain to you what it shows if you don't. So this is an Italian comic strip of Italian cartoonist Zero Calcare. He's an Italian cartoonist. I took this idea from reading the book of one of my, you know, most appreciated colleagues and friends, Tiziana Terranova, who just published a collection of her essays about the internet. She's an internet scholar, and she in her book she gave this example, which I found absolutely revealing in terms of understanding time and technology, time and algorithms. So what happens in the comic strip is that, you know, Zero Calcare is the protagonist, the hero, and he's also the cartoonist. And he describes a normal, ordinary day occurrence, something that occurs very ordinarily in the daily life of many people. So it's 9 in the evening, it's almost 9 in the evening, and Zero Calcare has to finish some work. He has to finish some work in time for a deadline he has on the following day. But at this time, he's considering another possibility. I'm not going to work, he says, but I'm going to indulge in other bodily pleasures, and I'm not going to respect the deadline because, you know, I don't want to. So I would like to do this, I would like to eat some dinner, to go out, etc. Then there is a kind of superego appearing to him, and it's the shape and the spectre of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who actually, she appears and no, she says, you know, in a very violent way, she reminds him, no, you really have to work and you have to complete this deadline. Okay, so the violence of Margaret Thatcher actually wins, and he decides to put himself to work and says, okay, I'm going to switch on my computer and check my emails. That was the mistake. After 5 hours later, at about 2:15 in the morning, Zero Calcare has been absorbed in what his animal spirit, which you can see there, calls the Bermuda time zone. The Bermuda time zone is the span of time between 9 p.m. and 2 p.m. exactly, and I'm quoting Tiziana Terranova here, where apparently normal people sit in front of the computer and within the time of an eye blink, realize that 5 hours have inexplicably passed. swallowed by a dense curtain of fog and oblivion, jeopardizing deadlines, exams, health, everything. So one of the explanations that Zero Calcare gives to himself, apart from he says, I can't have been drugged with Rohypnol, who could have given to me this drug, or having kidnapped by the aliens, but another explanation he finds is that the Facebook chat has a kind of hypnotic function that can be activated around that time. But in fact, and I'm quoting Tiziana Terranova again here, as his brain's long-term memory short-circuited by what Sherry Turkle once described as computer holding power, software is paying attention, accumulating a mass of microdata about his interaction with the network. A quick retrieval of the chronology on his web browser brings back unknown memories of aimless drifting from website to website, chasing trivial information. So basically, while long-term memory of Zero Calcare has been totally, short-circuited, but the software is still has the power to check what happened. It's got this memory. And so, having a look at the chronology, he finds out that basically what he had been doing was just drifting, going from website to website, not really doing what he was knowing, captured by this power of the microscopic power of the links and the clicks. So what happened in Zero Calcare's consciousness is that something got lost. What got lost? And here I connect again to the way in which I think algorithms very importantly work today, a dimension of the work of algorithms, a way of functioning of algorithms, this time in relation to human phenomenology, that was exemplified already a long time ago already by HFT, high-frequency trading algorithms, but also every recommendation system today would actually show that to us. That is a velocity of the algorithm, a capacity of the algorithm of connecting things, take decisions, appearing to us, inducing us to do things in temporal intervals that are actually ungraspable by human consciousness. And it's not a trivial detail. In doing so, the algorithm inserts itself in the famous lost second we talked about before. It's a lost half second Massumi famously used to define affect, the notion of affect, and from which all affect theory came afterwards. And also it relates to what Katherine Hales defines as the unthought. Katherine Hales talks about the non-conscious cognition of algorithms, but there is an unconscious level in human cognition as well. So basically what she does is to challenge the centrality of consciousness. What is important in order to understand how intelligence works is now not just its conscious way of working, but its non-conscious way of working. And so this does away with the anthropomorphic vision of intelligence. The unthought, that's how Katherine Hales talks about it. And in this way, algorithms are able, by working in this way, to directly insert themselves in that time of indecision. The time of indecision I had started my presentation with. The time where consciousness emerges. So in this way, I think the relation between time and algorithms, the individuation of this kind of non-conscious algorithmic or machinic temporality is what really, I think, allows us to go beyond the link between AI, artificial intelligence, and existing institutions, or institutions as we know them, especially time as we know it. So the idea of algorithms having become a sort of institution in themselves is not new. Benjamin Bratton is a philosopher and a theorist who actually has said all this in a much more sophisticated way when talking about the stack, because obviously what we mean by the algorithm becoming institution in itself is also connected to that. It's a very good and sophisticated description, but I think it's very much focused on the spatial, the political, territorial pervasiveness of the stack. I think that a very interesting analysis at this point would be to look at the temporality of the stack. The way in which he says, he himself, Benjamin Bratton, says that basically the stack is also made of all these tempos, different tempos of the different strata coming together, but also united by one monotonous or monotonic singular logic, which is that of algorithmic time, the algorithmic connection of time. And it's in fact not a new fact that institutions as we know them in their difference are all united under the sign of one main unique institution. We can call it the algorithm, we can call it artificial intelligence, we can call it the platform, but that's one thing to bear in mind. At this point, my conclusion came, but I think it's a bit late, isn't it? So I can leave it without concluding, or am I allowed a bit more? So, okay, everything I said is not really, it's a kind of a project that I have. It's not really something that I have, it comes from something that I've studied so far, but it's also a project that I have, a prospective research project. But here I would like to conclude by connecting all this that I've said with one last thought, and it's that with all its instituting activity during modernity, with all its instituting activity, modernity has actually brought to completion the exhaustion of the human. So here, of course, I'm referring to another. So I started with the. No, we don't want to go there. I started with the. I started with Deleuze's institutions, and I think that today is worth, in order to reflect on that, taking another concept, which was actually not one of the first concepts devised by Deleuze, but one of the last, which was the concept of the exhausted. So another famous conceptualization by Deleuze, the exhausted. So he famously talked about Samuel Beckett's work in a little book which was called The Exhausted. And so he said an interesting thing. The exhausted is more than the tired. Being exhausted doesn't mean to be tired. It's something different. It's something more. The institutions of modernity, I would say, have exhausted the human. There is a difference, Deleuze argues, between exhaustion and tiredness. The tired does not dispose of any other subjective possibility and cannot put into act any other objective possibility, but possibility is still there. The tired is just that the tired cannot do anything in order to actualize that possibility, because the possible can never be entirely actuated. The tired only exhausts the possibility of putting the possible into act. But the exhausted is something different. The exhausted exhausts all the possible, says Deleuze. There is no possible anymore. The tired cannot realize anymore, but the exhausted cannot possibilize. There is no possible anymore. So let us bear in mind the dualism between art and science. You remember at the beginning of the discussion, the hiatus, the human hiatus, brings about also the separation between institutional activity and the expressive gesture. It was art during modernity that actually showed the exhaustion of the human during modern times. That's why Samuel Beckett becomes an interesting example for Deleuze, to show what happens with modernity, with institutions. Art during modernity still had the capacity to indicate the exhaustion of the human, exemplifying this process of exhaustion of all possibilities. Samuel Beckett's work is a combinatoric, basically. No, if you know his work a little bit, but anyway, what Deleuze says about Samuel Beckett's work is that he keeps multiplying gestures, doing a sort of combinatorics of the gestures. Now his characters keep repeating, doing, but it's not a simple repetition. It's a way of combining movements just for the sake of combining them. A sort of digital, I would say, no? Primordial digital combinatorics. And in fact, in the book that was mentioned for my presentation, Moving Without a Body, I talked, for example, about a choreographer, Merce Cunningham, who used the digital technology to choreograph dance as a kind of digital combinatorics that reminded me very much of this combinatorics of gestures. Anyway, so digital, we are speaking about modernity, and we are speaking about also in terms of digital creativity when? Last decades of the 20th century, beginning of the 2000s. It seemed a time where digital creativity could still indicate the exhaustion of the human. There was still a possibility to proclaim exhaustion. So my conclusion today is that actually, so I'll pass because otherwise it will still take too much. So the temporality of the algorithms, which if I had more time, I would also explain in terms of recursion, etc., etc. So my last suggestion, and pardon me without explaining it because I don't have time left, but I would like to make it anyway. So the last suggestion is now algorithmic temporality basically exhausts the possibility of being exhausted. Now, I would like to read this. So, algorithmic possibility actually determines the fact that the importance of this word, exhaustion, passes into the background with all its associated meanings: exhaustive, exhausting, extinct. dissolved. The human cannot declare its exhaustion anymore, having acquired the possibility of regenerating itself, its own model, each time again and again. One can always begin again, and in fact one today does always begin again, and the word, I was referring to ChatGPT in the part that actually disappeared from this talk, so I would have talked a little bit about ChatGPT and large language models, but basically to arrive to the conclusion that the word is always again now the first again, never the last, and trapped in never-ending generations of the new. We will not be able to exhaust ourselves, not even in words anymore, not even pronouncing a last word and then hashing, which would perhaps be the most ethical action or one of the most ethical actions, at least by a Western thinker. Thank you.